All right, welcome into the Illini Audible podcast. My name is Sayed Bravo. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the pod. As always, I really appreciate it. And as always, we're back talking some more Illinois football. And today I'm joined by a special guest who is joining me right now. But it's kind of my background's a little different because I've been having internet issues in my room, so I'm moving closer to the router. So just kind of establish that right off the bat. But now I'm joined by LC Norton of SB Nation down in Bloomington, Indiana. So LC, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this football game. Can I give the audience a little bit of background on yourself before we dive into the full football of it all?
Yeah, absolutely. Want me to just go ahead?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I started covering IU as a student, just for a student paper back in like 2019. I started covering football in 2021, which was, if you're familiar at all with Indiana football, a really cool time to start covering them as a student. But I've been doing it on a freelance basis ever since then. I've seen a lot of Indiana football. Some would say a bit too much, given what it's been until last season. So I, I've seen enough, and last season was kind of jarring as far as like, oh wow, that can happen. That's real. So that's fun.
No, for sure. I think us like these programs, both Illinois, Indiana, two very, I think, similar programs in terms of the trajectory that they've taken over recent times. I will say I do think they're very different in distinct ways, just because of the expectancy of it all. Right? I think Illinois was kind of building themselves up year after year to kind of get to where they are, and Indiana's just kind of burst onto the scene. And we'll talk about that a little later, but. Let's just hop right into everything this game kind of has to offer. Obviously, a game of high consequence for both teams. It's for both, obviously Illinois and Indiana, they both played pretty cupcake games up until this point, and this is obviously the start of conference play. And obviously, I think it's notable to note that Indiana last season had kind of waited until, or not waited, but they hadn't faced like a very big high level opponent until Ohio State very late in the year. And then this season, you kind of kick off conference play with playing Illinois, a team that's highly touted in the rankings. So I guess we know how big this game is for Illinois, but how big is this game for Indiana?
So when I've discussed like this game in particular, I've called it probably the most important game of Signetti's tenure up to this point, with the only potential exceptions being obviously the college football playoff game against Illinois. That's obviously huge, and maybe kind of sort of Ohio State. Ohio State, I don't want to say they're playing with house money, but the stakes weren't necessarily as high as they are right now. So how I view this for Indiana is it's as much for it. They need to win this to like not necessarily keep their college football playoff hopes alive, because obviously you could suffer a loss and going on and make the playoff, but they do have that talking point on their back that they can't win those big games. They can't win these top 10 matchups, and Illinois is a bona fide top 10 team. I believe they're number 9 currently in the nation. So for Indiana, it really does kind of matter as far as the narrative goes, but you can like debate how much that actually matters. But they do need to win this game just to like finally get that off their back. And I don't want to say be taken seriously, but that talking point can kind of diminish itself for a little bit, and you can kind of recognize like, okay, Indiana's actual program last year might not have been a fluke. Whereas if they lose this game at home, they will face some accusations that, oh, last year it was all the schedule, it wasn't the actual team, yada yada yada.
Yeah, I think a lot of people view Indiana as, dare I say, I'm going to say it because just that's what people have been, the way that people have been talking about this program. I feel like they view this program as a fraudulent, even though you got to give them credit. I mean, in the eyes of the committee, they did everything that they needed to do. I would argue that they took care of business more, and obviously the schedules were different, but I would argue that they took care of business more than Illinois did last season. I mean, Indiana demolished Nebraska. Indiana took care of business against Washington. Granted, both of those programs went to Bloomington. Indiana also took care of business against Michigan, a program that Illinois beat as well. And obviously, it's a tough ask for Indiana to beat Ohio State, but they came up short. But they bottom line, I think they did enough. And just the truth is that Illinois, obviously, they went to Oregon and it was rough. They went to Penn State and it was rough. They lost at home at Minnesota. I think if they don't lose at home at Minnesota, I think you could be looking at maybe a significantly, maybe somewhat different season than what Illinois had last year. But it's so interesting because I think if you flip any of the results, if Indiana goes to Washington or if Indiana goes to Nebraska last season, then I think you're looking, and they win those games, I think you're looking at a much more respectable kind of program.
Yeah, and I chatted with some Nebraska folks ahead of that game last year. And actually, interestingly enough, one of the questions he asked me was how I would feel if at the time, so it's obviously 2024, if Indiana took on Illinois. And I really wasn't ready to pick a winner in that game, much like it's going to be hard to pick one today, because it's like Illinois was a better team than every team Indiana beat last year. And so I wasn't ready to pick okay, I don't think Indiana's gonna win that one running away. But yeah, the book on Indiana last year was yes. The schedule was they did not face a ton of top teams, and the teams they beat weren't all that great, but hey, the teams they beat, they capital B beat. They were grinding these teams into the ground. And the only two teams they lost to ended up being the two that were in the national championship game. And the thing about those games against, an Ohio State or against a Notre Dame, they're hard to win unless you're Michigan or Northern Illinois, I guess. But yeah, that was an issue with IU last year that they faltered in those two big games. But hey, it was Cignetti's first year. One of the reasons that he has this big game issue on his back is that he's only had those two opportunities. There's coaches around the country who've had countless opportunities and haven't been able to capitalize. He's had just those two. So it'd be interesting to see how IU handles those types of matchups, including this weekend moving forward.
Yeah, I feel like this is a huge barometer for both teams, right? I personally feel like both of these teams are they're pretty similar is my point. But yeah, I and obviously the catalyst for all of this is the man at the top, Curt Cignetti. So I guess, to have a guy who was in his first season accomplish what he did, a guy who's been pretty much everywhere. I mean, this is a dude who started at Pitt back in the 80s, Davidson, went to Rice, went to Temple, then Pitt again, and then NC State. And now he goes to Alabama. He goes to University of Pennsylvania. Yeah. But he ends up as a head coach at Indiana, a lifelong football guy. I am fascinated by this Curt Cignetti guy. What has he? I guess what kind of expectations were there up until last season?
So the whole deal for Cignetti hire was really interesting how that went about, because obviously they made the move to fire Tom Allen. That was there was a huge price tag attached to that, one of the largest in the sport's history. That wasn't a small move. So you could tell, okay, if they're going to pay that much, they can't just hire some retread or something, or they have to actually make a splashy hire. And Scott Dolson has had to handle Indiana's athletic director. Has had to handle a handful of coaching hires at this point. And it's been clear through the amount of ones he's had to go through is he plays his cards extremely close to his chest. There really aren't leaks. There weren't leaks with past men's basketball hire DeVries. There weren't really leaks when he hired Mike Woodson about 4 years ago. And there weren't really any leaks about Curt Cignetti until essentially the contract signing. The move was imminent. So it was interesting because you heard a few names that were popping up and around. I know Paul Christ was one, Jason Candle was one, but Cignetti, he had obviously just done that at JMU moving up from FCS to FBS and kind of taking the Sun Belt by storm in a similar way that he ended up taking the Big Ten by storm. But it was just clear what Dolson was looking for in a head coach was he needed somebody who'd won in a lot of places. Signetti accomplished that at just about every level he was at. But he also specifically wanted someone who had experience with quarterbacks. Like that was very close to the top of his to-do list. Someone who had coached quarterbacks before, who had like shown success with different types of quarterbacks, maximizing that position, whatever the strengths of the guy at that position are, to win games. And Signetti's done that. Like he's had a ton of different kinds of quarterbacks that he's coached, and he's won with all of them. Like he's found ways to maximize those strengths. So the thing you need to know about Signetti, the thing that makes him so great at what he does, it's not like some special sauce, not some special scheme, not even necessarily like some special recruiting, because a lot of Indiana players aren't like former 5 stars or 4 stars. Whenever anybody asks like me, hey, what's this guy's deal? What makes him so great at this? It's how he handles personnel. And that goes as far as like his roster management and the coaches on his staff. So Signetti's on the older end. I don't know if this is the exact age off the top of my head. I believe he's like the high end of the 60s. But if you look at his staff, it's just like full of young coaches who all have like innovative ideas. Like there's no like random retread, like a defensive coordinator who's been just about everywhere, an offensive coordinator who's like a name you've heard a million times before. Like these are new coaches who've grown with Signetti in his system and risen to the positions they are right now, like offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan, defensive coordinator Bryant Hands. They've both been with Signetti for such a long time and developed with him. And it's the same for all the position coaches. They're all really young dudes with like newer ideas who have just learned and developed over time. And his staff is like ridiculously good, and that includes the strength coach, by the way, which is just as important, if not more important, than a coordinator. So he's managed the staff really well. He's made the right hire. He's not going to hire a guy just because he's like buds of the guy. And then the roster, like you look at like the amount, for the most part, you look at the amount of players at each position. It just like makes sense as far as a roster management perspective between depth, starting snaps, yada yada yada. He's managed that. He managed that. That's why they were so good last year. Is that he built. It's incredible the work he did in the portal. He built a really amazing year one roster just through the portal, through like a handful of high school recruits, and just combining that with what Indiana already had. And I'm not sure the roster has. It's very strong this year. I'm not sure it has like quite the strengths of last year's roster, but that is really what makes him so good at this. Like he has managed his staff and his roster so well that in a way that just makes sense. He does it better than almost anybody else. That's his whole thing.
That's fascinating because as you say all of that, I feel like I'm drawing parallels to Brett Bielema, who's a guy who has a very, very solidified coaching staff with guys who have done it for a long time, who are highly respected around coaching circles. The way that he's retained players as well. But just kind of drawing all those comparisons, it gets me even more excited for the game. I guess what has made beyond the, obviously you mentioned the personnel and how you know he's built this team, but I guess for what you've seen for the sample size of a season and 3 games, how would you describe this Indiana football team and what it is how it is it plays under Kurt Signetti?
So one of the reasons Indiana's been so good, especially in, as crazy as this is to say, and especially in Big Ten play last year, is the style of offense they play. Most Big Ten defenses are simply not prepared for it. Like that's really what burned Nebraska, because Nebraska played a very Big Ten style defense. Those Big Ten style defenses, like, yeah, they're really built to like cover the run, but they're not built for the kind of offense that Signetti runs, which is we're going to spread the ball to as many different receivers as possible. We're going to throw the ball a lot. It's going to be options, standard passing plays, but they are going to like maximize. They need a quarterback who can read the field well, and Curtis Rourke was really good at that. But like Indiana like tore Nebraska to shreds because Nebraska is just not built to defend a team that was going to throw the ball to like or even 5 or 6 receivers a game. Like that's just not Nebraska's wheelhouse. That's not most of the Big Ten's wheelhouse. Only when Indiana played those former Pac-12 teams, like well, UCLA was the way UCLA is as a program right now. It didn't stand much of a
Yeah,
chance.
yeah,
But
yeah,
Washington, like Jed Fish had seen that kind of offense before, and obviously Ohio State just being Ohio State, they were able to defend that kind of offense a bit better than say Nebraska could. And then as far as the defense goes, Haynes is, and just going to state this right now, I think both of Indiana's coordinators are probably going to be head coaches sooner rather than later. I don't think they're going to get hired away to a larger coordinator job unless something crazy happens. Because I think they're really loyal to Cignetti, so they'd have to find a reason to like leave, and there's not really one. But they're also really, really good coaches. I know Shanahan's already been like I don't want to say I don't want to say nothing sourced here, but just like I've seen his name floated around for like the Virginia Tech opening. Um, but Haynes, uh, just like Shanahan, he's on the younger end. Really interesting defensive mind. Like they Haynes's defense really, really goes in on making sure offenses don't turn a 1st and 10 into a 2nd and short. Like they really, really want to get you into long, 2nd and long, or even a 3rd and long, ideally. So they really, really try to limit the amount of yards an offense can pick up on 1st down. Sometimes that results in them getting burned. Like they've gotten burned a few times. Like even against Kennesaw State, like they had real issues containing explosive plays. And even against Northwestern last year, Northwestern was able to get a few deep passes to go. But just they've been so consistently good on 1st down to just limit a series. And that's the bread and butter of the defensive end of Indiana.
So a lot of really good insight by you. That my hesitancy to kind of take Illinois and take them as favorites for this. Obviously, they're not favorites. They came in as underdogs. Obviously, they're going to go to Memorial Stadium in Indiana and Bloomington, so it's a lot of factors coming into this game. But you mentioned a couple of the things that Indiana has gotten wrong, I guess, throughout the past couple of games, even leaking towards back to last season. Illinois is a team that has had first half troubles against first half kind of stumbles, not really all that much in terms of like the troubles. But I guess going to the strength of this program, or what Kurt Cignetti came here to really polish, was the quarterback position. And this year it's Fernando Mendoza. I guess what have you seen from him, and what's kind of, I guess what's kind of behind all the, I guess, stardom of what it is, or how has he played this season for you, for Indiana?
So I'll start this by just describing Curtis Rourke, which might be a bit interesting. So what made Curtis Rourke so good? He was a huge dude. He was like 6'5". You could see just about every bit of the field. And that was like his 6th year of college football. He was a very, very old starting quarterback for college. But because he'd seen so much football, he was really, really good at making the reads that Cignetti's offense really needs a quarterback to make. That's my cat right there. And that's part of what made Indiana so good and reliable last year, was they had a really steady hand at quarterback. Fernando Mendoza is different. He's also a big dude. He's about 6'5", same height. But he has one thing. He has one thing that Rourke lacked. Rourke had something that he lacks. So the thing that Fernando Mendoza has that Curtis Rourke lacked was Fernando Mendoza can move it a little bit. Curtis Rourke was really, really restricted to the pocket. He couldn't really bail a ton. Occasionally he would, like maybe a handful of times during the season, he could run and pick up a 1st down. But I was always kind of worrying every time he did it. Mendoza can run it a little bit. He's not going to be like, I don't think they're going to call too many designed runs for him. But he's a guy who can scramble and pick up yards if need be, and do that reliably. Like he scrambled him for a touchdown more than once through the first 3 games of the season. And he can scramble out if he's facing like a pass rush. He can get open passing lanes downfield. But the other things that make Fernando Mendoza really good is just he has an NFL caliber arm. Like it is every bit the arm talent. He has like I don't want to say it's like a big issue, but he has had issues where he will just laser. He'll put too much mustard in the pass that's a bit short that he probably could have put a bit more touch on. Uh, but he's really, really good, and I've kind of touched on this. But what's the hype with him is that he's on a handful of NFL draft boards, and he's been talked about as potential like one of the first quarterbacks off the board next spring. But that hasn't really that like NFL hype, and this doesn't always happen, obviously, hasn't really carried over to the kind of player he is in college. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is what Curtis Rourke had that he lacks, and that's just pure experience playing the game.
Yeah.
Uh, so obviously he started all last year for Cal, and he was a good starter for them. But he just doesn't have like the sheer amount of experience. He doesn't have like the snap ability to make reads that Rourke had. It even happened against Indiana State of all teams. He should have handed the ball off. It was a play in the first quarter, and instead he waited way too long to make a decision, and he ended up running it himself and getting hit. And Kurt Cignetti was very, very visibly upset with him for that. Called him over on the sideline, gave him some hard coaching up. But that's one of the things he lacks that Rourke had. But it's kind of interesting because, like, the things that Rourke didn't have, Fernando Mendoza has. The things that you'd really like Fernando Mendoza to have, such as experience, Curtis Rourke had in spades. So that's really what makes Fernando just such an interesting player for this offense.
That's fascinating because I think a lot of the times when we look at players that end up being really good in the NFL, I think that the biggest thing that coaches look for is reps, right? Or that's among the biggest things that they look for or are indicators for a successful quarterback in the NFL. But then you have picks like Anthony Richardson, who is a guy who had like a year as a starter. Mitch Trubisky, who had a year as a starter and was immediately picked top 5 just based on pure talent and pure ability and arm. So that's fascinating. And I think when you have both, it's the best of both worlds, but obviously in the modern NFL and the modern NIL era, it gets so complicated and jumbled. But kind of moving along as well. I guess what have you? I think the biggest news out of Bloomington this week is the loss of Lee Beebe as a running back. Right? Did I say that correctly? I feel like I might have butchered it.
It's BB. It's
Yeah,
kind of
right.
it looks like you might say it B, but it's BB.
Yeah.
But yeah, his deal. He suffered an injury against Indiana State. Some people were worried that he was like in that late, but
Yeah.
like Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star put it best. Like they have a lot of reliable running backs, and literally someone had to carry the ball. So that's like a non-issue. But yeah, he suffered a season-ending injury against Indiana State. It's unfortunate for Indiana. But the thing about Indiana with its running backs is Indiana prioritizes a very like specific kind of running back. Just about all of Indiana's backs are 5'10", they're short, they're stocky, and they just like lower a shoulder into a guy. They pick up yards just through brute force, and they're really, really good at running the ball. But what's good for Indiana about that is it has like a reliable amount of dudes like that. Like Roman Hemby's the lead back out of the backfield. He'll be good to go. They have Kalen Black, who's a bit older. He was with Cignetti, if I'm mistaken, he was with Cignetti at JMU. There were a handful of players like that last year. Some have left, some are still on the roster. And they do have another back who got some time against Indiana State. His name is Kobe Martin. He's a redshirt freshman, and he fits that Kurt Cignetti, the John Miller mold of running back they look for, like that 5'10", really bruising rusher. He got some work against Indiana State, and he looked a lot like he did at Fishers High School like just outside of Indianapolis. He was a really hard dude to tackle back then. He's a really hard dude to tackle right now. So for that, and I've like thought about this a little bit, I'm not exactly sure how they're going to handle the running back position because they do like to have those 3 backs. Sometimes it's over the course of a season, it's usually condensed itself down to 2. Last year it was Justus Ellison and Tyson Lawton, and I think they could be serviceable. with Hemby and Black in the backfield. However, I wouldn't be surprised if Martin gets a bit more run, and based on how he looked against Indiana State, obviously Indiana State being Indiana State, I think he'd be reliable, but I wouldn't factor him to get too many carries against Illinois unless the coaching staff or he knows something we don't.
So, kind of along those lines as well, though. I mean, there's something to be said just about this offense in general. I guess whatever you, Omar Cooper and Elijah Surratt. I mean, those are the two
Surratt.
guys who Surratt are the two guys who are leading this wide receiver core, I believe. I guess
Yeah,
what is there to look after in terms of this wide receiver core? Is it mostly just the two go-to guys, or is it kind of a rotational kind of thing?
one thing to consider with this wide receiver core is I believe his name was Tyler Morris. He was a transfer from Michigan. Uh, he was going to be out of the slot, and he was performing really, really well in camp. They lost him to injury in the offseason, so that's kind of messed up Indiana's wide receiver rotation a little bit. But yes, the room is led by Surratt and Cooper. Surratt's really, really good, especially on those back shoulder fades. And he's been a reliable target just throughout. Like he was a reliable target all of last year. He was Indiana's top receiver last year. Omar Cooper, he's been in Bloomington for it feels like a really long time because I remember him being around when I was a student. But yeah, he's really come along the past like 2 or so years, and he's been excellent through the first 3 weeks. He's leading Indiana in touchdowns. He's leading Indiana in yards. And how he buttered his bread the past few seasons was he was able to really go up and make those contested catches through the first few games of the season. And mind you, it was against the competition they played, Old Dominion, Indiana State, yada yada yada. But he's been really good just as a pure runner. Like he's been able to show off some really pure speed. I'm interested to see how that speed will look against like a power conference defense as opposed to a Sun Belt defense or a Conference USA defense. But yeah, he's been excellent so far. And it's been interesting to just see him develop over the years. But yeah, as far as like between Cooper and Surratt, those are two of the better wide receivers in the entire Big Ten. I'd just go ahead and say that. But after that, it gets a bit more interesting, especially for an offense that really likes to spread the ball around as much as it can. EJ Williams, he's been around for a minute. He's, if I'm not mistaken, was a former Clemson receiver that transferred when Tom Allen was still a head coach, stayed along. Had a weird little saga with an injury last year. Came back this year and he's played pretty well. Jonathan Brady transferred over from Cal. He was one of Fernando Mendoza's targets. Like Indiana's kind of done that back-to-back years, like just getting a receiver from the quarterback that they landed in the transfer portal. He hasn't really. He's been much more of a return man. He even had a return for a touchdown in week 1, but he hasn't really flashed as much as a receiver, which is a bit interesting. Charlie Becker has had like a handful of catches. Some of them come in like late game situations. So I'm not sure how much staying power that'll have. And one really fun thing is Indiana has a receiver named LeBron. He's a true freshman, though. LeBron Bond. I wouldn't expect him to get many snaps during this game just due to the stakes and him being a true freshman. But yeah, he's gotten targeted a few times. And Indiana doesn't target the tight ends a lot. But if it does, it would probably be Holden Stays, former Tennessee transfer.
So I feel like we've been talking a lot about the strengths of this Indiana team, and I feel like, well, but this Indiana team could be primed for a big one here, but also, it's a top 25 matchup for a reason. What is your biggest concern coming into this game in terms of maybe positional group or maybe a pattern that you've noticed? I guess what is the concern?
So I'll start with this. Illinois is a very, very good team. Obviously, just like out of all the teams Indiana's played under Kurt Cignetti, they are easily one of the best. But if I have any concerns for this game specifically, Indiana has had a few times where, like I mentioned earlier, it's allowed some explosive plays. it's allowed some like really like not ideal like 30-yard receptions. It allowed them against Kennesaw State. It allowed a few explosive passes of that nature to Jack Lausch at Northwestern last year. And it's been sort of a bend don't break deal where Indiana will let up that kind of pass, but as soon as like that drive gets downfield, they'll usually steal up and be better. But that's a concerning trend because at some point someone's going to be able to capitalize off of that kind of explosive play, and you do have to sort of live with that, but not ideal situation. And if there's anything else, I'd be worried about if I were Indiana. I don't think the depth is quite where last year's team was. Last year they like had quite a few guys who were like, yeah, if that guy needed to step up into this situation, he could play a serviceable role. This year, I'm not sure that's as true, especially in places like wide receiver. The defensive line has been interesting for the first few weeks. They've been good. Obviously, CJ West was excellent last season as a defensive tackle. He lost him to the NFL draft. And they've replaced him with mostly G5 transfers, which, yeah, these are good players who played a lot of football, but you do need size down in the trenches, and you're not going to find a ton of that at the lower levels of the sport. And they've really prioritized that in high school recruiting. But I'm interested to see how this defensive front holds up against a power conference. And if I had like worries, it'd be like, can Illinois really capitalize on explosive plays, or literally on the whole other end of the spectrum, can Illinois run the ball really well and sort of get out to an early lead and just kind of sit on the game from there? If I was Indiana, those would be my two foremost concerns.
That is awesome insight. I think we'll put a bow on this with what nearly every podcast does. And it's a podcast cliche, but let's do some predictions. It's predictions time, man. I always tell this to everyone who hops on with me. Personally, I don't like predictions. I think score predictions are a bit, I don't know what the word is, but it just, but it's fun, right? Like it's fun. So I guess let's start with you. What is your prediction in terms of winner, score, and then something that you think will happen in the game? Like, let's say, uh, something like a blown coverage for a touchdown or something like that.
Alrighty, so I'm the same way. I'm not a huge predictions guy, but if I did have something for this game, so one of the things with Indiana that I don't want to say was an issue last season, but they were so good in these games that they never really faced like a pressure situation until Michigan, where we have to play for the game in the fourth quarter. Usually, every game was like decently wrapped up by the end of the third, and there was not a worry. It's like, okay, let's just like run the ball from here, end this game, let's get out of here with a win. But the first time they really had to like actually like play football in the fourth quarter was against Michigan. And they ended up on top of that, but like if that game went any longer, which obviously weird hypothetical, but it's like I'm not sure they would win a war of attrition against Michigan. So I don't think this is going to be an Indiana blowout, for one. I do think, and I'll just say this: it's going to be a home game for Indiana. They're going to have that advantage. Obviously, Memorial Stadium catches a lot of flack for the way it is, and the way fans have been responding to this success and just past seasons. That stadium's going to be full. I've seen it full for a similar. Indiana had a very sort of similar matchup a few years ago where Cincinnati visited town, and the year they made the college football playoff, and it was a competitive game throughout, and the stadium was full. So that's not going to be a worry at all. But if I had to go, like, if you forced me to make a prediction, I would go, I think Indiana 28, Illinois 24. And if really just due to like, okay, Indiana's going to have the home field advantage, is that's what it would come down to. I don't think this is going to be any sort of like strong blowout game. I do think it's going to be a close one. And if I had to predict any sort of leverage play, Omar Cooper is going to probably find a way to make a big play at some point.
Awesome. I will I will see your prediction and I will raise you another. Illinois, I think, is a program that has the experience, that has gone on to Nebraska, has gone to, obviously they lost at Penn State, they lost to Oregon. They've seen, but the point is that they've seen all these high caliber environments, that they've had all these high pressure situations, that they've pulled out of a lot of situations that have been, critical, that have been highly contested. I think when I think of Illinois pulling out a last minute win, you think of that Rutgers game in Illinois. Luke Altmaier had that pass to Pat Bryant that went to a touchdown for the game winning touchdown. But with that being said, I do think there is credit that I think we have to give to Illinois for having accomplished those things. Now, obviously, it is a new season, and you need to see those this season, and you're missing a couple stars, but you also replace them with a couple players. But I think this is more of a pro Illinois take than it is an anti Indiana take, because I still have so much faith in Kurt Cignetti, what Kurt Cignetti is as a coach. I still think that Indiana as a program has been reinvigorated and is primed to be one of the better programs in the Big Ten over the next however many years. But I think Illinois pulls out of this one. It'll be a 27-24 game-winning field goal by David Orlano. And the reason I say that is because, like I mentioned, they played in hostile environments before. This should be a routine for a lot of these players because they have a bunch of returning players. I think they had 18 returning total returners from last season. Their experience, Luke Altmaier's a quarterback and all that stuff. I just think Illinois is primed to establish themselves as a team that can win these high leverage games, even with the days post a Pat Bryant. They still have a very similar team, and it's a team that we should also notice. We should also take into account the fact that Illinois does have significant depth at defensive position and defensive positions, and also in the wide receiver core. So that's, to me, that is my reasoning. And it could also just be the fact that both of us are pretty estranged to the programs that we don't cover. So there's probably a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible for Illinois. Like, obviously, I think Altmaier being back is huge because roster continuity is everything in college sports. But also, just based on like the Cignetti's assessment of Illinois' defense, he really noted just how multiple they can be and how they'll be able to disguise coverages, make things hard on Mendoza. And as aforementioned, Mendoza doesn't have all the playing experience in the world, so that could come up. But yeah, totally possible. Like, Illinois could pull that off. Like, it's very easy to see that happening.
I think the key for both teams, I think for both teams, it's going to be pressure the quarterback no matter what. I think when Illinois has had pressure, Luke Altmaier has been able to pull out some pretty crazy moves, but it's still, I mean, bottom line, you pressure the quarterback, you get to the quarterback, you're more likely to win. You're more likely to get a sack. You're more likely to get a quarterback that makes mistakes. I think the same can be said about Mendoza, and the challenge will be getting past that offensive line. I think is an experienced line as well. I think the key for Illinois will also be capitalizing on the mistakes for Mendoza, because that secondary is pretty experienced, and up until this point, they haven't had a signature interception. They haven't. In fact, I think they've only had one interception throughout the entire season. That's been against, cookie cutter, minimal opponents, FBS schools and all that stuff. So I think for Indiana, I think the key will be to capitalize, obviously pressure the quarterback, but also I think be able to run the ball, because I think Illinois as a defense, the defensive line, it has been a program, place of the team, a positional group that has been seen as a strength, but I don't think they've been totally tested all too much throughout the season. But we'll see. I think it'll be a fun one. I'm looking forward. Are you going to be there on Saturday?
Probably not. I'll be watching remotely, but yeah, it should be a good game, all things considered. A fun night game for Indiana. It's been a minute since they've had like a really good one of those, which obviously last year. But Yeah, all things
Awesome.
considered, it'll be a great game.
All right, man. Well, I really appreciate you jumping on. It's been really fun. A lot of really, really good insight. So if you guys haven't already, please check out your SB Nation part of the site, right? Because I obviously work for the Champagne Room. You work for the Indiana site. So, you just, colleagues.
Yeah.
All right. So transitioning now to the kind of the latter half of this podcast. I know last time what I did was I did the first half, just me giving my overview and my expectations for this game. But this time I decided to put my guests first and then kind of what I expect from this team going into this game. Obviously, like I mentioned, bit of a different setup, so it's a bit interesting for me in doing this in my kitchen or living room or whatever. But I am enjoying this. I do think this is probably one of the better episodes that we've done here on the Atlanta Audible podcast. But let's just jump into what it's gonna take and what we're gonna have to do. What Illinois, excuse me, not we, never we. What Illinois is gonna have to do to kind of to secure a win in this game. Obviously, as I mentioned, the key for Illinois is going to be getting pressure on the quarterback, getting pressure on Mendoza, which is it might prove to be a tough task because of how good the offensive line might be, how experienced it is at Indiana, and just the size of those guys and just the challenge that Illinois has not seen. Maybe they've seen it against Duke, but they haven't really seen it over the course of these past couple of games. Listen, one of the couple, there's a couple guys who I do think I think are going to step up. I'll get into that a little bit later, just because I want those guys to be the surprise team. Like I said, though, I do think Illinois is going to be. I think Illinois is primed to have a game where they do win, but I do think it will be similar to what it was against Nebraska, to what it was against all these other, maybe not against Michigan, but I think when I think of Illinois maybe having the possibility of winning a game like this, you get Illinois against Kansas, Illinois against Nebraska. That's what I think of. But listen, what is Illinois going to have to do to really prove that they can win this game? Well, it's going to start at the offensive line for me, because the first half, Illinois went against Michigan and against Duke, Western Michigan, excuse me. They struggled. Bottom line, they struggled in that first half. We talked about this extensively. I do think that Illinois, they haven't gone through injuries. They've been pretty solid. They've had Schuster get in there for a couple snaps as well, and I think that's bode well for their offensive line. Albeit, I do think they've struggled. This is a group that has struggled in the first half. That in the second half, I've seen a couple schematic changes, and it's made for maybe an easier time for this program to kind of get into a rhythm. But I do think that it's going to start at the offensive line and protecting Luke Altmaier, because Luke Altmaier has been really, really good when he's time in the pocket. And so that's one of the things that I look at, and I tend to think that if Illinois is going to have success against this Indiana program, it's going to derive from the success they have in the offensive line. Now, with that being said, I also do think that we're going to have to see significant amount of production in the running game as well, because of the nature of yes, you do have guys who have proven that they can be Guagi, right? They can go up and get it, guys, like a guy like Justin Boak, a guy that maybe we'll see a little bit of action could be Malik LZ, although we haven't seen him up to this point all that much. They put him in a couple critical positions, but overall, it just hasn't been what I personally expected from this particular player. But I do think that Illinois, beyond Hank Beatty, beyond Colin Dixon, and Colin Dixon hasn't had as much production as maybe I thought by the time Illinois got to Game 4. But beyond Hank Beatty, it's going to be – that's the guy at the top of their depth chart. So Illinois is going to have to establish the run way better than they have throughout these previous couple games. We'll see if they do that, because what it's largely been is this program being able to primarily pass the ball or do an aerial attack and then use the running backs as a complementary element to that. and the fundamentals of football indicate that you run the ball first and then you go for a pass. Is the idea of establishing the run. I think Caden Fagan, they've talked about how he needs to focus. He's talked about how he needs to not think and just run and attack the holes harder. Well, that starts against Indiana. I mean, you're going to have to do that against Indiana if Illinois wants to win this game. And if Illinois feels like they definitely can win this game, then it's going to be a question for that. I do think that Caden Fagan has a lot to prove. In my eyes, he still has a lot to prove. If you ask me, I think there's definitely a lot of upside in Khalil Valentine. I trust Khalil Valentine. I think what we've seen from him is that he can be a really shifty guy, really fast guy, and also another thing, a bonus on top of that is that he hasn't had a fumble. I think that's an underrated aspect of this whole thing, is because I think when you have a young running back who maybe looks a little bit smaller, maybe he's more apt to drop the ball or to get a fumble. But it largely has not been that. We'll see how that pans out against Big Ten competition. But I do think that inspires a lot of confidence for this program. But I think we'll see if Aiden Lawfrey is good to go next for this game. I don't think Illinois will talk to Brett Bielema will talk to the media this morning. I'm recording this on Wednesday, but it'll release on Thursday morning. It'll be interesting to see how that whole thing pans out. I do think that, obviously, most obvious statement of the day, but Illinois wants to go in healthy with all the running backs. So we'll see how that ends up panning out. I think another underrated aspect of this whole thing will be the idea that I think Illinois will need to take advantage, or their secondary will need to actually force turnovers. I know that they've done through through the trenches, they've been able to force a couple fumbles, which has certainly been positive for this team. But bottom line, a lot of these programs that they faced just physically haven't matched up against Illinois, particularly Western Illinois and Western Michigan. I think Duke is a little bit better, and they had those 5 turnovers, but you just want to see that at a Big Ten level. I think last season, Illinois had a couple – Xavier Scott had that huge game against Kansas. I want Xavier Scott to have a signature play in this game. I think if you're Illinois, you want to come in and you want to feel confident about your secondary. You want to feel confident about their ability to force turnovers, not just in the trenches, but also aerial, against a relatively young quarterback who, as LC said, he hasn't had all that many reps in its totality. And more reps makes you a better quarterback. It's why Luke Altmaier is one of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten and perhaps better quarterbacks in the country. And if you can take advantage of the idea that this is a younger kid in the realm of college football, in the realm of Big Ten, hasn't seen a Big Ten team, kind of like how Dylan Raiola was one of those guys who was a younger guy last season, and he ran into a wall against Illinois, kind of, not all too much, but he fell short is the point. Do the same against a kid in Mendoza. Come on. I think if they can do that, then that'll help. They win the turnover margin, and that'll help them win the game. The most obvious statement again, but I do think that interception is due for this Illinois defense, and particularly the secondary. All right, my 2 guys who I think are going to make a difference in this game, who have been under the radar a bit relative to all of it, but they have had some degree of impact. But I do think that could be elevated in this game against Indiana, albeit it could go the other way because of the fact that you're playing a Big Ten team, a team that hasn't really seen a team that is that step up, is that really head-to-head matchup, and you don't really feel like you go in with a full advantage expecting to win. I think the guy I look at is Geno Hunt, who has had – last time had 10 snaps, but he's been a steady contributor for this team, and who, in a blink of an eye, has entered his 3rd season, who has come back from a significant injury in the past, and I think is a guy who is poised to make a difference in this game, who's had largely made a difference throughout these past couple games, I think. And I think he'll continue to do that, and I think he's been a guy that I think people have pointed out and has said this could be a dude who can be a high contributor against in this program, and I personally I think that he's due. I think another one of those guys adjacent is Malachi Hood again, who last game had 37 snaps, but I think for me, the guy that I am looking at and I am kind of fascinated by just his sudden emergence, and hopefully he can, for the sake of this Illinois program, contribute in the same way that he did over the in the past game. And obviously it's hard to read because of the fact that they played a team that is Western Michigan, and you wonder how that competition kind of levels up. I think in a large part this defensive line has faced, against Duke, they faced a significant offensive line, but the challenge, it's hard to gauge how much of a challenge they've actually been faced with, because for a large part, the thought is that Illinois has big strength in that defensive line because of the level of depth, because of the experience. Guys like Leon Lowry, guys like James Thompson, guys like Kurt Neal, those Wisconsin guys who have come in and have infused this defensive line with a lot of momentum, with a lot of I guess energy and experience. We'll see how that all really pans out. Man, don't sleep on Angelo McCullum, who last game had 20 snaps and made a kind of an impact. He won the co-MVP on defensive side of the ball last game. If he's able to continue what he did against Western Michigan, I think if it goes week to week and he can continue growing in that way, have a significant couple more snaps, and maybe this is a guy who can make an impact. I think obviously Gabe Akis is a guy who you're always going to look at to be that game wrecker. And like I mentioned, the Wisconsin guys are those guys who you look at and you think, okay, this is a guy. These are guys who have that potential. But it's just going to be a question of whether or not they're able to kind of work it all in. It's going to be interesting to see how this team kind of handles everything against Indiana. I'm looking forward to it. It should be one of the funnest games of the season. I'm expecting a really, really packed stadium, a game that should be remembered for a while in Illinois if it does go the way that Illinois wants it. Obviously, if it doesn't, it's going to be another point of contention as well. It's going to be just so fascinating to see how this whole thing pans out. Another thing to mention is that Luke Altmaier is going to have to play largely how he's played over the course of his last calendar year, and because he's played excellent over the last year against Big Ten opponents. Besides that Oregon game, which was kind of a mess on all cylinders. He even played pretty well against Minnesota in that loss as well. And so I'm curious to see the progression that we continue to see for Luke Altmaier, how that is, because obviously there's a lot to be said about his. You need to give him credit for, even though you face pretty minimalistic opponents, I guess, if there's for lack of a better term, there's still a lot to be said about what he's done over the course of these past 3 games. And the lack of mistakes, I think really in that first game, he took a lot of sacks that were mostly on him. But I think for the most part, he's been relatively clean. And I think you have to give him credit for that as well. And just the idea of him just being level-headed and all that, I think that'll be interesting to follow as well. As far as the injury report, we'll see what ends up happening. I don't have it. We don't have that information fully. We'll find out more by the time you listen to this. Obviously, Dylan Rosiak is going to be a player that they really want back. Jaheim Clark at the defensive back, he should be back this week. That is going to be key for this defensive back room. These cornerbacks, I think for the most part, they've been playing really well. Obviously, it's hard to get a gauge of just purely because of the competition. It's so tough, right? Let's talk about that a little bit. It's so tough to get a gauge for what it is that football, that's why the AP poll feels like such a crapshoot in the early goings. really, like, we can't ignore the fact that Illinois might be as fraudulent as people think Indiana is. Like, that's just a fact. Why? Because it's a new season. They've had these first half struggles. They haven't faced anyone. They just haven't. It's not like the NFL where you go up week one and you face, whatever X team, let's say Jaguars against who else is another team? Miami, right? Well, just use the Florida teams, for example. Either team could win, not just because they both seem like teams that might be mediocre, but purely just because it's the NFL. And that's from the get-go, week 1 to week 17, week 18, whatever. Like that is from start to finish, that's what it is. And in college football, it's just totally different. That's why there's so many people that say SEC football is so much better than Big Ten. I think a lot of the Big Ten schedules just don't offer the same level of competition that they do in the Big Ten or in the SEC. I think a lot of it is also, the nature of college football. It's just programs have to bring in all these smaller programs to give that check that you scratch my back, I scratch yours element of it all. And so that's kind of how it is. But this is when it gets real, man. We've made it to real football, real college football, high stakes football. And it'll be fun. It'll be fun to see. We'll see if Illinois' momentum, we'll see if Indiana's momentum will carry over to this season. I think a lot of people suspect that it does. Brett Bielema and Kurt Cignetti are two of the finer coaches in the Big Ten. Kurt Cignetti came out of nowhere. Brett Bielema has been building this program for a while. And to those people who say that Indiana, or this year's Illinois, is kind of the same as last year's Indiana, I take issue with that. Because the biggest thing you have to remember is that last season, Indiana came out of nowhere. They weren't expected to make any noise. They weren't expected to do anything last season. And they came out of nowhere with a new coaching staff, integrated a new system, everything with an experienced quarterback, and they went to the college football playoff, albeit they got their ass whooped against Notre Dame. But point is, they did it. Illinois, since 2022, since they went to the Relia Quest Bowl, this has been a program that has been slowly building their way up to relevance. Now, because of the updated college football playoff bracket, you have a program that is building their way up to the highest level of relevance. We'll see if they actually can pay it off, because no question, we just haven't seen it. It can be all rosy whenever we want to walk into the walls of the Smith Center, and rosy whenever they beat an opponent like Western Michigan and Western Illinois. We have to see how they perform against these Big Ten programs, because Big Ten competition is just different. And we all know this. It doesn't bear repeating, but I'll do it anyways. Like I mentioned before, last season, Pat Bryant and Sakari Franklin, you get out of jail free cards a lot of the time last season. You won a lot of games that were within the margin. You think about that Rutgers game. You think about that Purdue game that I think people can argue you shouldn't have won. You think about that Kansas game. You think about the Nebraska game. A lot of credit goes to Illinois for winning those one-score games. But you should have questions about whether or not they can do it again this season. I suspect that they can, based on coaching, based on depth, based on the quarterback. But there's no question to me that we've seen things in the first half that you might have questions about, you rightfully so. We'll see how it all pans out. I'm excited to watch this full thing go down. It should be a fun rest of the season. It all starts here against Indiana. If you can win against Indiana, who knows what the rest of the season can hold in store for Illinois. I do think the rest of the schedule is less favorable than if Indiana goes to Oregon and wins that game. If they go and beat another team, Penn State, then they firmly put themselves in the map. But Illinois needs to take care of business against Indiana. They have those two high caliber matchups against USC and Ohio State at home, both games at home. But man, if they can win this one, then that'll do a lot of heavy lifting in the AP poll. We'll see. It's exciting. It's exciting. There's no question. It is exciting. But yeah, all right. But with that being said, that's pretty much all I had. I hope you guys enjoyed. I think this was, like I said, one of the better episodes that I've done, a line out of a podcast. So subscribe, rate, review, if you so please. Thank you so much for listening, watching, and then we'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.